27-year-old Walter Carmen was a veteran. After serving 4 years in Vietnam, now Walter was only able to work odd jobs here and there that he often got hired for through a few friends in his neighborhood. Nowadays, he was working as a front desk security guard during the night and a local farmer by the day. It paid the bills and made for a really simple, quaint life. That's exactly what he wanted for himself, after living through the unpredictability and constant rush of the war. Another aspect of his life was his high school crush that had now turned into a long-time, steady girlfriend, Jeannie. They had moved in together as soon as they realized that they were pretty serious about each other, and that both of them wanted the same things in life. That had really cemented their relationship, and now their relationship was going through a rough patch. They wanted to have kids and had been trying for them over the years, to no avail. They could not have children. But instead of letting that unfortunate reality get to them and tear them apart, they accepted it as their fate and decided to move on. Over time, Jeannie grew interested in adopting a child if they couldn't have one of their own. So they started looking into that, but after a lot of research and many interviews with various adoption agencies, they just didn't qualify. They accepted that as their fate too, and moved on with their day-to-day life. On one fateful night of one such day, Walter was at his night shift. He had just done his rounds and was now back at the front desk. To kill the time he had on his hands, he often listened to a portable radio during his long sleepless nights. He was doing just that on this night too, just cruising through some of the channels when something on the radio caught his attention. The Weather Channel just announced a major lightning storm advisory for Clarksville. That prompted Walter to run to the phone and call his girlfriend Jeannie to gather up most of the farm animals and lead them to the barn for shelter during the storm. They had a vast, open but fenced-in area where they often let their animals roam freely, even during the night sometimes. That night was one such night. The weather had been nice during the day, so they had no idea it would get that bad during the night. Janine got the message and rushed to gather all their animals together. They were in for a long night, and an even longer day tomorrow. As soon as Walter's shift ended, he raced home that morning. He was anxious to get back and assess any damage that the storm might have caused to his home or farm. On reaching the home, he did a once-over of the whole area and found some damage to the barn roof. He quickly asked Jeannie to bring over the ladder so he could check the extent of the damage from the rooftop. She brought one over and held it as Walter reached the top. To his dismay, the whole gutter had been torn down from last night's bad storm. It was going to take a little bit of work to fix it, especially if they wanted it done before another storm hit the place and caused even more damage. The very next day, Walter started fixing the broken gutter on the barn. He was fully immersed in his work when he heard a really loud scuffing noise from far away. He hurriedly stood up to see what the commotion was. He could see some trees breaking from the far tree line. That did not bode well. He raced down the ladder and rushed inside to grab his rifle. When he looked into the scope, he saw a large, very hairy man, or maybe something else entirely, stumbling around in the woods while carrying something in his arm, more like clutching something to its chest. Walter yelled at Jeannie to get her gun ready and stay in the house and rushed outside once again, instructing Jeannie to lock the door behind him. He walked into the thick forest with his rifle ready on his shoulder and his eyes looking into the scope, waiting for a good shot if attacked. As he was pondering on where to hit first, if he sensed that being to be dangerous, he actually came across that large creature. He did not have to shoot the creature at all. It already had about a dozen or more gunshots in its chest, profusely bleeding out. He still had no idea what or who the creature was. It looked distinctly human, but also not very human at all at the same time. Walter was getting friendly vibes from the creature, as it had shown no harm to him at the moment. He was wondering how to approach the creature when it suddenly fell down to its knees. It was still clutching the bundle in its arms. It beckoned Walter closer with a motion of its head. Walter hesitated on going even closer to the creature, fearing it might just attack if he got any more close, but the creature's eyes seemed to be begging him to step near. Walter took a deep, solidifying breath to gather his courage and walked towards the creature. As soon as he was near enough, the creature removed the bundle from his chest and proceeded to hand it to Walter. It was a thick, torn blanket with a hairy baby looking back at him. He looked back at the creature in shock, wondering if it really meant what he was thinking it meant. The creature nodded his head and, in the next moment, passed away. Walter walked back to the barn with his rifle slung over his shoulder, carrying the baby creature in his arms. He was still bewildered at what had transpired. It must have been just a little bit over an hour when he decided to come to the forest, looking for a possible threat, and now he was returning back with a baby in his hands. A baby whose species he didn't even know. It was baffling, to say the least. Jeannie ran out of the side when she saw him coming back to the house. She stopped in her tracks when she saw him holding a bundle of cloth very gently in his arms. She could guess what it might be. She hesitantly stepped closer, confusion evident in her eyes as well as her steps, and pulled back the blanket, revealing its contents. She came face to face with it and saw the creature staring back at her. She let out a small shriek of shock and backed up in fear. Walter quickly grabbed her arm to calm her down, telling her there was nothing to be afraid of. He walked into the house, taking Jeannie and the baby along with him, and explained to her about the encounter he had with the large creature in the center of the woods. After much deliberation and discussion on what to do next, they came to the conclusion that it was fate. Maybe they weren't given a child of their own because they were going to come across this baby one day. Maybe this was the child they were always destined to have. They decided to raise the baby as their own. The next day, Walter went back to the woods to look for the creature once again, this time to give it a proper goodbye. He buried the creature in another location of the forest line and marked up the place for the future. They were ready to start on their life journey, with a baby in tow this time. They named the baby Hank, after Jeannie's favorite uncle who had recently passed just last year. As months went by and both of them tried to raise the baby together, things began to get harder and harder for them. The baby was growing much faster than an average human baby, and it was getting harder and harder for them to keep up with the rapid changes the kid was going through. He was starting to get more curious around the farm and about himself, and he was just a toddler at that point. Walter kept working nights at his main job, and Jeannie was always around to keep an eye on Hank. They tried giving him the same life as they would to an actual human baby, but most of it was lost on Hank. He much preferred animals to human company. That's why he had taken to living in the barn with the horses as he grew up further. The concept of being fully clothed was also lost on him. They tried many times and even succeeded in keeping him clothed in his younger years, but with his growing age, his clothes kept getting lesser. They now just barely convinced him to at least keep his lower body covered. They had guessed that he might be what mythical stories call a giant, to be more specific, and that theory proved itself too when Hank went on to grow up to be 6 feet tall, and that too just in his preteen years. That also came with a very, very large appetite, and his food preference also gravitated towards carnivore, so they had to work really hard to keep him properly fed. Time kept passing as it always does, and they tried really hard to stay as much a real family as possible. Soon, Hank was almost an adult, but still a teenager, they assumed. He had started sharing responsibilities with his parents on the farm. He had a much easier time handling the farm animals than Walter and Jeannie. He just had a way of connecting with the animals. He stayed with the animals in the barn, fed them, cleaned them, milked them if they needed, and altogether took over most of the animal-related farm responsibilities. It was very much a relief for Walter in his hectic daily routine. He now had room to breathe. One day, Walter had to leave for his night shift early because he was covering for one of his buddies who worked the shift before him. He trusted Hank to take care of the things on the land, so he wasn't much worried and left the farm in the afternoon. That evening, Hank was out and about gathering the animals together when a few unwanted guests walked out onto Walter's land. They were hunters and seemed to be chasing a deer into his cornfield. Hank spotted them before they could notice him. He could also hear their rapid gunshots. It triggered a set of long-forgotten memories for Hank that he could not make any sense of, and that really scared him. He ran back into the barn and hid himself, trying to understand what was happening. By that time, Jeannie had also noticed the intruders, so she had grabbed her gun and had come out of the house. She met with the 3 hunters in the center of the field and asked them to leave as it was a private property and not a hunting ground. The hunters laughed at her and refused to do so. Before she could fire her own gun, one of the hunters aimed his rifle straight at her and fired right away. The bullet hit her in the head, killing her instantly. Hank saw everything happening from the crack of the barn door. He stood rooted to the spot, frozen in shock at the sight. The poor guy witnessed his pseudo-mother dying right in front of his eyes. He was beyond shock and grief, but still very scared, of present and of the past. The hunters did not waste much time in the fields after that. They grabbed the deer and walked back to the forest, leaving Jeannie's body to nature, dead and getting colder by the minute. Hank came out of the barn after he was sure the hunters were long gone. He walked over to Jeannie and carried her lifeless body back to the house, all the while crying inconsolably. He laid her out on the couch in the sitting room and kept crying over her all throughout the night. The very next morning, Walter came home and saw that none of the animals were out roaming the grounds. He quickly headed to the barn looking for Hank and to ask him why the animals were still in the barn, but found that he was not in there at all. It really struck him as odd, as Hank was always either in the fields or in the barn. Always. He rushed to the house, fearing that something might have happened to Hank. He entered the house and the first thing he saw was Hank, wiping the tears from his face. The next thing he saw was what Hank was standing next to, the lifeless body of Jeannie, splattered in blood. It looked like someone, Hank, had clumsily tried to clean her up but was unsuccessful in the effort to do so. The bullet hole in her head was also unmistakable. She was dead. Long dead. Walter screamed as he ran over to her, cradled her cold head in his arms, crying and yelling, "What happened?" Hank pointed outside to the field and Walter quickly got up, wiping his eyes. He grabbed his hand and asked Hank to show him who did it. Hank tearfully led Walter deep into the thick forest. It was a journey unlike any they had ever had. They were both filled with grief, anger, and fear, albeit with different amounts. It all came to a head when they started hearing hunters shooting their guns off not far away, and they saw 2 deer run past them in fear of the hunters. In his hurry, Walter had forgotten to bring his rifle, so he was totally unarmed in the wake of such grave danger. So he decided to come back for those hunters again, and this time, armed. For the time being, however, he decided to retreat back to safety, so he grabbed Hank and both of them ran back to the farm, away from the danger, but with a mind of coming back there once again. Later that night, after Walter had cleaned Jeannie up and they had given her a proper burial, Walter decided it was time for the truth to come out. So he sat down with Hank and tried to explain to him that the hunters were the ones that had hunted down his birth mother and had killed her, and now they just took Jeannie, his current guardian, away from him too. We must put an end to all this and never let anything like this to ever happen to anyone again. To anyone. No one else should bring any harm to this place or the people living in here, Walter said. He believed these words wholeheartedly too. No one, human or not, should live to see their family taken away from them so cruelly, especially from the hands of a human. It was wrong, and it had to be stopped at any cost. Later that night, Hank knew that it was time to take his revenge on the hunters. He was filled with anger. He had lost not one, but 2 mothers at the hands of hunters. It was time to hunt them back. He did not have anything with him to aid him in his quest, except his ability to blend into the thick forest, and he made good use of that. They did not even know when he got to them. They stayed busy drinking and laughing, living their lives, unaware of just how close the danger was to them, just how close to their deaths they were. Killing them, one by hand, was much more satisfying than using some measly gun. It gave them a far more painful death. He enjoyed their screams of anguish as he ripped them apart with his bare hands and mouth. The forest stayed awake that night, with agonized screams and terrifying roars. Later, when Hank returned back home in the early hours of the morning, covered in blood, but not even a single drop of his own, Walter took one look at him and knew that there was no turning back for him now. He was sad to let their peaceful lives go, but was proud that the child he raised was now ready to take on the world. Walter would just have to train Hank to protect himself, and he did. Just like his own father had once trained him in guerrilla warfare tactics, Walter imparted the same knowledge onto Hank. They had some grueling days ahead of themselves. Years later, Hank had grown into an adult, and after Walter's passing, the whole farm was passed on to him. He had also taken over the whole woods. He was almost ruler of the whole area, and he showed no mercy to humans. He would track any hunters or other harmful trespassers down within 100 miles of Clarksville, and he would proceed to hunt them. He was always ruthless. No one lived to tell the tale. Just their remains told their sorry stories. A cautionary tale for anyone who might feel daring in the future. Over the years, other creatures from the forest also started coming forward as they got acquainted with Hank. They were interested in learning what Hank knew and helping him in protecting their home. Hank passed on the skills Walter taught him over the years, and soon they were a force to be reckoned with. It took time and sacrifices, but the woods of Clarksville had a private army, a very ruthless and bloody army of terrifying creatures. 18 years later, even after the death of Walter, the locals can sometimes hear the large colony of those creatures passing through the forest. It would always cause the ground to shake for miles, showing the large number of the guardians of the forest. They kept the woods free from any human intrusion. Locals warned passing visitors to stay away from Carmen's old farm, but there would always be some hotheads who thought it was all a hoax, to cover up something big or mysterious going on in the area, or an old lady's made-up story to scare away the weak-hearted, and they would try to trespass the area anyway, regardless of the warnings. Most of them come up missing, and no bodies were ever found. Over the years, people have been reporting large creatures filmed lurking in the deep forest, but nobody dares to investigate this case any further. Not even the government dares to send any of their heavily armed soldiers into a known massacre. So whenever you visit Clarksville, beware of Hank and his very well-trained giants, always waiting for a challenge. And remember to never cross their path.